always fascinated by how people get into this, to doing recreations of historic people. And I got into it, like most people, in a roundabout way. I've always had a love of theater. I did a lot of theater growing up. It was my undergraduate major. And I even got my master's degree in drama, kind of thinking maybe I would teach it. But I had this great love of history. And I'd always been drawn to, especially historic house museums. So I went and got my PhD in history thinking, you know, put the theater aside. I'm going to work in the world of history, museums, history education. So I got my PhD, and the very first historic house museum I was working at, they discovered I had a theater background, and they said, we've always wanted someone to do a portrayal of this local woman. She was a temperance advocate. She was very much in the prohibition, shut down alcohol movement. So I did that, and I thought, this is a really interesting way to do history, because part of the reason is it's fun. So for people who don't necessarily want to read a book about a person, they might be interested in coming to hear that person talk. What did they wear? What did they look like? How did they do their hair? But also you get introduced to the idea that what they did was often part of who they were, you know, that these were emotional issues. You know, why did this woman care so much about stopping the manufacturing of alcohol? So I did that, and I was intrigued, and I thought, I bet there are other characters that would be interesting to the public. So I started doing other characters in the local Chicago area where I live. And then I kept broadening it out. And what I found was that there were a lot of people interested in history programming, women's clubs and libraries and museums and book clubs and civic groups. Yeah. So it really grew. I started out the first year that I did this, I did maybe 3 or 4. And then the next year I was doing maybe, 3 or 4 a month. In 2013, I started doing historical portrayals and history lectures full time. So I've been doing this full time since 2013. And it's amazing. I mean, the number of people who are interested in meeting people from the past is really amazing to me. I have created altogether about about 18 portrayals. I was doing Mary Pickford for a while after the Greenville Chautauqua had invited me to do that. Unfortunately, she's not, as fascinating as her story is, she's not that well known. I find that I can only hold maybe, 7 or 8 people in my head at one time. There are characters of mine, including, actually, I have a Titanic survivor, a stewardess, and she's been in my repertoire from the beginning. Same thing with Amelia Earhart. She's eternally fascinating. Eleanor Roosevelt, she's eternally fascinating. There's certain ones that just they never lose their interest. I know a number of people who only do Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And that's it. That's all they do. And they look like Lincoln, and they, there's probably 5 Lincolns in the Chicago area that just do Lincoln. I mean, maybe he's more popular, in Illinois, but still, there's a whole association of Abraham Lincoln presenters. For many years, I was introducing a new character every single year. I've pulled back on that a lot, but it's a real challenge choosing a new character, as much as it's refreshing for me, because part of what I like the most is doing the research and creating the character. But it's a challenge, because what I found is it has to be a sweet spot between what I find really compelling. Because if I'm going to spend, and it takes me about a year to put together a new character, if I'm going to spend a year with this person, it has to be someone that I find really compelling.
Right.
But it also has to be a character that there's a broad enough appeal to the public that there's going to be enough of an audience for this character to make it worth my while. So where do I find that sweet spot right between that? And I've had a few characters that I've done that I didn't necessarily think in the beginning that I would love this character, but there was something about them I found compelling. So for example, it's important to me that I have a broad range of women in terms of you know, how well known they are or how unknown they are, how, what fields of work did they work in? You know, were they political? Were they artistic? Were they, you know, I want a broad range. And for some of them, it was pretty easy. So for example, Louisa May Alcott was an easy pick for me because I was a huge fan of Little Women. So I felt like I already had this connection to her. I knew that Little Women remains one of the most beloved books in the canon. And I thought there was a lot people don't know about her. You know, as much as her name is well known, a lot of people don't know she worked as a Civil War nurse. She was really a very progressive thinker, and for all that Little Women, you know, tries to kind of stay within the bounds of 19th century, you know, womanhood, that turned out to be such a good blend between all the areas that I tried to cover. Some of the others, it was less of an it was more difficult for me. So for example, I really wanted to have a female scientist, but my background is all in the humanities. I love, you know, history and theater, and I studied English literature in college. So science is not my forte, but I had worked at a number of museums, and one of the museums I worked at was a nature museum. I worked in exhibit development at an arboretum here. So I thought, could I work with a scientist who worked in nature? And that's what led me to Rachel Carson. And that was an interesting pick because her name today, she's not a household name like she probably should be.
Spring? Are you kidding?
I know, yeah. The number of people who've never heard of her is amazing. But I felt like she would pull people in because anyone who's interested in the earth, I'm doing her this month a lot because it's Earth Month. And I thought it was a name that ought to be a household name. So the challenge for me with Rachel Carson is not only did I have to learn her story and her writing, I also had to learn a lot of the science, which is not my forte, but I pushed through it because I really felt the story was really important. And to this day, that program, which I really actually like the way that the script turned out for that program. It's the one program I do that immediately people start looking for ways to apply it to their own lives today. I always get questions about, okay, so how do I apply what I now know about, you know, the impact of pesticides on the earth and, you know, what we're doing? How do I apply that to my life today? I much more infrequently get questions about like, I don't know, Jackie Kennedy and her interest in historic preservations. People don't ask, well, you know, how can I work on historic preservation of the White House today? Normally, I'm having to help people make the connection to the world today, to their own lives. Every time I do a character, something is revealed to me that I hadn't necessarily thought about going in. And in the case of Rachel Carson, it was just how applicable what she talks about is to the world today. I think you're absolutely right that the issues she talked, and what's interesting is not necessarily the actual pesticides. Most of the pesticides that she talks about in Silent Spring have been banned. She talks about 10 different chemicals in that book. 8 of them were eventually banned. 2 of them were put under severe restrictions. So it's not like you can go to that book and learn about Roundup. The whole idea of being aware of the impact of what we do to the planet with pesticides and insecticides, and the fact that mankind is, you know, innately enmeshed with nature, this, you know, mind shift. We're not above nature, we're part of nature. The fact that there aren't a lot of women who go into commercial aviation, it's a real issue. It's you know, it's 3 to 5% of commercial pilots in the United States today are women. And we might be aware of that if someone points it out, but we don't necessarily think immediately, like, why is this happening, and what is the impact for girls today? And it has to do, of course, not so much with a kind of glass ceiling in the world of aviation. It has to do with the issues why we have STEM projects, that girls aren't necessarily going into science and majoring in engineering or aviation. When I'm putting together a character, I'm always interested in, what does this person have to teach us today. One of the things that portrayals can do so well is to make it more front of mind that there are lessons from the past that are so relevant in today's world. And sometimes that's really obvious to an audience, and sometimes it's not. It happens very early. Sometimes when I do Amelia Earhart, in the Q&A afterwards, I'll talk about a study that was done, I think it was just a year or two ago, to show how early our images get in our mind. Yeah. They asked, I believe it was some kindergartners, they asked them to draw a picture of, and you'll see where I'm going right away, draw a picture of a doctor, draw a picture of a pilot, draw a picture of a firefighter, right? And so the kids did that. And then they said, well, guess what? We have a doctor and a pilot and a firefighter right here with us today. And they opened the door, and in came a female doctor, a female pilot, and a female, right? And almost all of the kids had drawn pictures of men in those roles. And that's how early it gets in. I'm reading a book that just recently came out about Pan Am stewardesses in the 60s. It's a really fascinating story, right? Because these women in the 60s, girls did not go out and travel the world. But for these women, for all the kind of extreme gender stereotypes on them, they were going out and traveling the world by themselves. And in Pan Am, it's international travel, and they're involved in international diplomacy. But the term stewardess became loaded with so much baggage, not just that it was woman, but this incredible popular culture image of these, kind of, sexy, loose women. And all the work that they did that was so important. It speaks again, right, to what reenacting can do, because it gives you a visual image of, whatever, a pilot, an artist. And I personally am often drawn to women who were breaking boundaries. I mean, I think that's where my interest as a researcher is. So when I'm looking at when I'm looking at characters, I'm often interested in Amelia Earhart breaking boundaries as a female in aviation. I'm interested in Rachel Carson breaking boundaries in science. I'm interested in Georgia O'Keeffe breaking boundaries in artists, and could a woman be a great artist? It is a challenge when you're presenting for kids, and most of what I do is for adults. But when I present for kids, the ones that I most often do for children are Amelia Earhart and Clara Barton. And I do Clara Barton specifically in her Civil War days, because I have a background in Civil War history, and I'm a member of the Chicago Civil War Roundtable, so I'm interested in that particular aspect of her. But it's interesting when I do Amelia Earhart, because Amelia Earhart is this fascinating historical character that is incredibly known and a role model both for adults and for children, which always fascinates me. When I do a character, I always go to the library and I look to see what books about this character are there in the children's section, and what books about this character are there in the adult section. And interestingly, with Clara Barton, there have only been a few full-length adult monographs about her, and she doesn't show up typically in Civil War history other than as a kind of a footnote. She's not the subject of major attention, although there's a recent book that puts her there. But when you look at children's books, there are a slew of children's books about Clara Barton, which really does suggest she's very much seen as a role model for children. There might be one or two children's books about Eleanor Roosevelt, and then a whole ton of adult books about her. Amelia Earhart is one of the rare characters that she has been written about as much for an adult audience as for a children's audience, which is somewhat unique. And she's the one character I do that when I show up for children, I have a lot of kids come up and tell me, oh, I dressed as her for Halloween. This is funny. I just did Amelia Earhart last night, and I got an email late last night from a woman who said me and my 8-year-old daughter watched your program last night, and my 8-year-old daughter was just enthralled. She loves Amelia Earhart, and then we went on your website, and now she wants to do what you do, which was so incredibly touching and interesting. And so I'm always really careful when I do Amelia Earhart, because I know what a special place she has in so many people's hearts. It is such a responsibility to enact Amelia Earhart, because I want to make sure that people know she really does. She really was deep down an amazing, inspiring person. When I've thought about doing characters who have warts, I always have to think about it carefully, because my role is not to go out there and crush dreams, but I don't think that the whole role of biography is solely and only to create role models. I think part of the value of history is, revealing that not everybody, was entirely perfect. The first villain that I have done is Lizzie Borden, which I just debuted this year. I started working on her, and it was because I didn't really have a villain. And it's maybe the hardest character I've ever done, because I don't want to set her up as a role model. But the reality is that she was found not guilty. The mystery of who killed her parents remains unsolved to this day. I have my own opinions about it.
Right.
But when you're presenting this person, people are going to make value judgments, and we always do, right? I don't want to present her as a too sympathetic character, but I also don't want to present her as an unsympathetic character. The reality is she fell somewhere in between. It's been surprisingly well received. It creates a great deal of discussion, which is what I was really hoping for. Sometimes I have to nudge it and say, and talk about how good a liar she might or might not have been. We'll never know. I mean, who knows what's really inside anyone's heart, especially that woman's. I don't want the audience to take everything she says at face value. And that's hard, because a lot of times when you feel like this historical person is in front of you, you want to take everything they say at face value.
One of the members of our board, this John Roeder, is a reenactor, and he did John Adams.
I saw that. I just watched it last week. Yeah, I was on. Yeah. I
really liked. I was very provoked by the idea of this, who knows what isn't lurking in anyone's head and why, but breaking down separate mob reaction from actually the facts on the ground. And especially since John Adams, would be able to evolve into someone who could be a revolutionary. He could be a Brit. Until he could no longer be a Brit. And I love that about what you all do. You provoke the reconsideration of how the institutions need to be honored.
I was just going to say something on that. What I loved about what he did was that when I finished up, my husband teaches history. He teaches political science and history at a community college. And as soon as we finished up, because he knows history really well, so we had this really great discussion about John Adams' place in history, and that whole idea of, taking on the defense of someone that not everybody around you is going to think these people are even worthy of being defended, but because you think it is so critical to our nation that everybody gets defense, everybody gets their moment, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, that is paramount, even more than your own personal feelings. And we had a really interesting discussion about what that means in American democracy today. And I thought, God, that's what great Chautauqua can do. I always want to remind myself when I tackle a new character, I always like to think about now, what do I want people to be talking about when they finish? What are the moments or the quotes or the issues raised that I want them to, I was at a museum once, and the woman who was talking about the education program, she said, I always think about what's the discussion in the car going home.
I wonder, has anyone done Atticus Finch?
Wait, that's a good question. I don't know. It'd be a great character to do.
Do you
Yeah.
want to do it in drag? I think you'd be fabulous.
But you know what? That's actually a really good point. I'm just working right now on a lecture, because I do lectures as well as portrayals. And there's a senior center in the Chicago area that's doing a whole series on race. And someone asked if I did anything specifically related to issues of race in history. And I said, well, some of the characters I do, absolutely, but I'm not comfortable stepping into someone who is another race from mine.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this very interesting book that just came out, maybe 3 years ago, about Ona Judge, who was an enslaved woman at Mount Vernon. She was one of George Washington's household, and he actually took her to Philadelphia. She ran away and was never caught. She went to New Hampshire, lived 50 years as a fugitive. The book itself is I think, masterful, because just finding evidence of this woman's, she was a fugitive, right? So her whole life was about not being out there. And this woman tracked down her marriage certificate and the death notice of her husband. It's amazing. But also what it means about how you write history of a person who was so committed to keeping themselves. Unfortunately, this woman gave 2 interviews near the end of her life. And I thought really hard, because I think this is such an important life story. Ona Judge's name should be as well known as Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, but we don't have material evidence, right? You know, you can go to the Museum of African American History and see Harriet Tubman's shawl or Nat Turner's Bible. She didn't leave any of that. She didn't write a slave narrative the way Frederick Douglass did. So we can't go to the store and read her story. So how do we work to keep her story out there? So I'm doing a lecture about her as part of my work to do it. But I keep thinking it is so much the kind of story that would work really well. And I know there are some people who do reenactments of Ona Judge, which I'm really grateful for. Unfortunately, they're not in the Chicago area. Yeah. But it's one of those areas where I think historical portrayals can do a real service to history by bringing these characters to life. Yeah. I started doing Georgia O'Keeffe in part because I really did want to have an artist. Yes. And it needed to be an artist, I felt, whose works could be seen by the majority of my audiences. And I know, and I knew that the Art Institute of Chicago had about 21 O'Keeffe paintings, and the Milwaukee Art Museum I think they have like 24 of them. So that was enormously helpful in doing it. What I discovered was that she actually is she's a wonderful person for a historical portrayal, because first of all, she's a household name. Second of all, and you can see her works. But second of all, even if you're not interested in art, what she had to say about how she reacted to the world around her, the landscape, flowers, the sky, it's something that people can relate to, even if they're not interested in art. And actually, I've had this program. In fact, the program I'm doing her this afternoon for, it's a gardening club. And they're interested in her because of her interest in nature. So that's been really fruitful. And she's also, at least towards the end of her life, she became quite a character, not eccentric, but people would show up at her house and she would walk out to the driveway and she said, "Oh, you're here to see me? Well, here I am. Here's the front of me. There's the back of me. Anything else?" So she was famously kind of prickly, which lends itself to sort of a dramatized portrayal. She's very visually identifiable, the headscarf that she liked to wear, and she usually wore black. She has a pull on audiences. In other words, it's a hook that gets people in, and they then are much more likely to be drawn into paying attention to the other parts of her that I think are really interesting about, how did she become a woman working in an art world that was so deeply male, you know, and there was a man who said to her, you know, one of the students at the Art Students League in New York said to her, well, you know, I'm going to be a famous artist. You'll probably just teach art at a girls' school somewhere. And I think she always fought against that notion that she didn't want to be seen as a woman artist. She wanted to be seen as an artist. And the flower paintings, which we are still among her most beloved paintings. I was just at a museum gift shop the other day, and they had some Georgia O'Keeffe note cards, and sure enough, they were all of her flowers. It's an easy way to get into her art. But I think she, as much as she was drawn to the colors and the way you can zoom in on the abstract features of her flowers, I think she never gave up doing flowers, but I think she pulled away from them in part because flowers were seen as this innately womanly kind of a thing to paint. So she made her flowers enormous and big, and the sexualized readings of them, which might or might not have been encouraged by Alfred Stieglitz, her husband, who is a really good art promoter of her work. I don't think that's where she wanted to be read. So what I always hope is that you get pulled in by, you know, the stories that she tells, you know, the fact that she, you know, she liked to sleep outside on her roof naked because it gave people something to talk about. But what it gets at is the fact that this was a woman who really was pushing against the boundaries of what an American artist could do, what modern art meant, what it meant to be a woman in an art field. And then I hope at the end, we can actually talk about, you know, well, how many female artists are there in art museums today? Answer is not a lot. And nobody really wants quotas of works by female artists in an art museum. But the reality is it's a teeny tiny percentage to this day. So what are the lessons from Georgia O'Keeffe that we can apply to help us understand what, you know, what makes, how do we identify great art? She's just endlessly fascinating. I love the fact that she's funny and she's relatable. Early on when I was doing this, someone specifically asked me to create a portrayal of Jackie Kennedy. And I was really hesitant. Not that I have anything, I think she was beautiful. I've always been fascinated by her. But there were a couple of reasons I was really hesitant. Number one, I don't look a lot like her. And I'm not, you know, I'm not a skinny person, and she was a lot tinier than I am. But even more than that, I thought, oh, you know, she hadn't really been a role model to me. Right. But as soon as I mentioned to people that I was thinking about doing a portrayal of her, oh my God, the reaction. Mm-hmm. So I thought, all right, I'm just going to try it. And I did. So I put together a portrayal, and I did it for a women's group that was having an afternoon tea. They had like twice as many people come up to this, sign up for this tea. So I realized, number one, this would be a good opportunity for me just in terms of working. But even more than that, when I got into her story, I thought, you know, a lot of people fall in love with Jackie Kennedy for reasons that are totally understandable. She was incredibly beautiful. And, you know, she really gave that White House this sense of history and culture that it really needed. The more I delved into the story, the more I thought, you know, I think sometimes people want to see her because they want a story that is pretty and beautiful. I had a group one time and they say to me, we're interested in the pretty ladies. We want the pretty ladies. And I thought, I'm not sure that's what history really is about. But as I'm going through the Jackie Kennedy story, I thought, you know, this is a woman who actually really did try to foreground, you know, that she was a wife and a mother. And I do think that was what she was most important. But when you look at the public image of the Kennedy White House, you really see how much of it she really constructed. I mean, that whole sense of the Kennedy years as being youthful and beautiful and a historic preservation of the White House, the whole notion of the arts as something that was embraced. this was enormously impactful. Even the idea that we think of the Kennedy years as Camelot, and whether you agree it was Camelot or not, historians have to confront this ingrained public idea of the Kennedy years as Camelot. She was the one who first put that forward. She was a lot savvier than she gets credit for. And I think she had much more of an influence than people actually think she has had. So that was a portrayal that actually surprised me. It was not a character that I would have chosen on my own, but I ended up being very grateful that I have done her. Here's what I would say. I was thinking about this because I'm doing a lecture right now on the history of Nancy Drew. And, you know, when Nancy Drew first came out, libraries wouldn't stock it because they said, this is not moral instruction. This is not high literature. This is fluff. You know, we're going to, you know, maybe we'll buy a few copies, but they're not going in the card catalog because we don't want kids to think this is what they should be reading. But after a while, when you get to the 60s with the rise of television and movies, and increasingly kids are not reading at all, and suddenly people are saying, Nancy Drew is great because you get kids to read. Sometimes I feel that way with Jackie Kennedy, that people who might not be interested in history at all, they might not have any interest in going to see a historical portrayal of Georgia O'Keeffe or Rachel Carson, but they might go to a historical event about Jackie Kennedy, and maybe I can open their eyes a little bit to you know, a more nuanced idea about who she was and what her importance was. You never know. You never know. I worked at a museum, and someone said to me with history, she said, you know, what we do is not to, you know, the whole point of it is not to tell someone everything there is to know about a topic. It's to light the candle. You know, get the flame going. Right. And I always think about that with the portrayals. I don't necessarily need to give people everything there is to know about a person's life. It's not a Wikipedia article that you turn into, you know, a first person monologue. It's to reveal something about this person or about this topic that'll light a fire and get right. people interested in thinking and talking and maybe wanting to learn more. And if I can do that, I've done my job. One of the issues, and for some reason, I think this applies more to women who do historical portrayals than to men. And I can't quite figure out why. But with women, it's harder to place them in history, right? Because Jackie Kennedy did have, and it's an issue that comes up with Eleanor Roosevelt too. You know, at what stage in their life do you present this person? And, you know, when I think about, let's say, I don't know, Mark Twain, there's like a visual image of Mark Twain that I have in my mind, and it's usually the way portrayals will present him. Similarly with Abraham Lincoln, right? There's a certain image of Abraham Lincoln that we have. It's not difficult to evoke that. But with a lot of women, it's much more difficult. And with Jackie Kennedy, you know, if I were to portray Jackie Kennedy in the 1980s, let's say, it'd be challenging because I don't think people would recognize her, right? We have this image of Jackie Kennedy in the era when she was most in the public eye, which was in the White House. So when I'm doing a woman, I try to evoke that character as well as I can. And I think with historical portrayals, it's always tough, right? Because you're not trying to do an impersonation. Like I don't have to exactly look like that person, but I should try to evoke that person. Right. So what I try to do typically is to portray that person at an age and a time when they were in the public eye, and hopefully at an age that closely matches mine. I was born in 1969. So, and here's the challenge I had. When I started doing Jackie Kennedy, and this was, I don't know, this was probably around 2006, something like that. So it wasn't that big a stretch for me to portray her as she was in the White House, which was in her early 30s. Well, of course, ever since then, I keep getting older and older and older, and she's sort of perpetually, 34, 35 years old. Darn it. So It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge. And to the point that I actually have wondered whether it's time to revisit that portrayal.
Right.
You know, how would I dress? You know, how do you
Right.
portray Jackie Kennedy? So even, well, circa 1970s maybe, but we think of her with the pillbox hat and the pearls and the gloves. It's a real challenge. In my programs, I often try to have some kind of an issue that the character is grappling with. And in the program I do of her, she's grappling with the idea of whether she should continue to live in Washington or should move somewhere else. You know, she'd always said she wanted to live where she had lived with JFK, but living in Georgetown is turning difficult. So she makes the decision to go to Georgetown. So the climax of the program is sort of the assassination.
When was she battling whether or not to remain in DC?
It was in 1964. And the assassination, November of 63, she moved to New York in the summer of 64. So it's really kind of set about a year after.
I see.
Yeah. And it's a challenge because then I had to deal with the issue of, well, you know, do I wear black? And, you know, part of me still thinks I should. I'm still revisiting that whole issue. I didn't because we don't associate her with wearing black. Costuming is really tough because I want to be historically accurate, right? But at the same time, I want to help the audience. I always feel like the costuming in a way is to help the audience enter the world that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And I want the costume to help do that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I've had a case where a costume that might be actually very historically accurate might not be the best choice because it might be hard for them to enter the world. For example, the one I'm thinking of that I really battled with this was when I was doing Eliza Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's wife. This was right when the Hamilton musical opened in Chicago. I wanted to set it towards the end of her life, and that would have been in like the 1830s, 1840s. Mm-hmm. But when people think Alexander Hamilton, they think 18th century. I did not want to set it any later than 1780s, 1790s. So I do historically accurate 1830s or not? And I decided to do it 18th century. I decided to set it in the around, you know, late 1790s because having costuming of that era would help the audience, mm-hmm. I thought, to get into it. The reality is it's all about the audience. And I've never forgotten that because when I'm making decisions about what costumes to wear, it's about the audience, right? I don't want to lead them astray with costuming that is inaccurate. But I also don't want to confuse them with costuming that doesn't help them evoke the scene. Same thing with just choice of character, right? I want a character that the audience will in some way relate to for whatever reason, whether it's because they are a fan of Jackie Kennedy or they love Georgia O'Keeffe's art or, you know, they're interested in Titanic. I want a character that will help pull people in. And, you know, whatever I do in the program, whatever I choose to include in my program is something that I think will in some way be of use to the audience, a historical lesson that they might want to learn from, a question they might want to grapple with, a quote from this person. When I do Eleanor Roosevelt, I station the whole thing around the question of whether she's going to join the United Nations or not. And I use that quote from her, "You must do the thing you think you cannot do." So I always am hoping that the lesson from it is what a good role model she is to face something that you're afraid of and face it courageously. It's all about the audience. And that's a really good kind of guidepost to use.
Right. When I have seen images of your work, of you as Jackie Kennedy, or at least, and it may be on the Greenville has a publication, but when I looked at the image of your character, Jackie, it's not that, don't misunderstand this at all.
Yeah.
But it was what she was wearing.
Yeah.
That day.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is going to be so wrenching.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
And it was her, it was we watched it not live, but it was as close as you got to live in those days. And the whole world stood still for the next 4 days.
Right.
And there was this constant bath and the blood on her skirt.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing I did not know you then. And I thought that is a very brave actress.
Yeah. And you know what? I have to say, I have gone back and forth about that suit. And that's actually a really good point, because the reason I chose to wear it was to put people in the mindset that this is not going to be just a pretty lady, that we're gonna tackle this issue. And in some ways, I do think that costume, and the reason I chose to wear it is because I do think it helps some people to be put in that mindset when the program begins. But I still question it. And the one I'm wearing right now probably needs to be rotated out. It's starting to grow old. I worry that it's a bit too powerful, at least for audiences today. And the dress itself, it still exists. It's in the National Archives. It has never been exhibited because I think it's too powerful. I've spoken to a woman who does Mary Lincoln, and we were talking about how the cape that Mary Lincoln wore on the night that Lincoln was assassinated, it also still exists. It's actually at the Chicago History Museum, and it has been exhibited, even though it still has Abraham Lincoln's blood on it. But it's not as powerful as Jackie Kennedy's suit. And we were talking about, part of that is because so much time has passed. You know, the Abraham Lincoln assassination is not living history to us today. But it's also the case that the Kennedy assassination was photographed, televised, you know, watched in live time. I worry, and I think I'm not going to use that suit anymore, because I think it might be too much. I think it might be impeding the audience's.
I'm going to retract my statement, but I do not want you to stop using that.
Oh.
Because what you forced me to do.
It's hard, you know, and you go through this issue anytime you're choosing a costume. It's hard. It makes me want to do Abraham Lincoln and just, you know, grow a beard and wear a stovepipe.
Jesus, you know, but I don't want, don't make me regret that I said that to you.
No, not at all. No.
As you got to know your audience, and you've got to let us return there.
Yeah. And that is what the program does. And you know what? Someone came up to me afterwards and she said, is there a more powerful outfit, piece of clothing in American history than Jackie Kennedy's pink suit? And I thought, wow, I had not thought about it that way, but I can't think of one. I mean, maybe Lincoln's stovepipe hat, but that represents his whole life. That suit is that moment. Yeah, it's powerful.
Leslie, here's the analogy to make. 9/11.
Yeah.
And the next 5 days.
Yes.
That's what we're shuddering over.
Yeah.
It's the next 5 days.
Yeah.
It's a total imprint in a way that nothing else accomplishes it.
Yes.
A world grieved.
I give a lecture on the history of First Ladies, and I talk about how the way that she constructed the funeral, and she oversaw all the details meticulously of the Kennedy funeral. And I think it was Linda Bird Johnson said, she gave us a focus for our national grief. Right. And she made that funeral a focus on not just the awfulness and the disaster of what had happened, but the dignity and the remembering the Kennedy years in this particular way. Not only the fact that, you know, we couldn't fall apart because she wasn't falling apart, but she gave us a focus for the grieving. And I thought, you know, that is what Jackie Kennedy did unbelievably skillfully. I mean, really, she was a master at understanding and I don't want to say manipulating, because I don't think there was anything fake about it. She understood how public image can have real impact and value to people's lives. So much of what I do is so easily replicated on a smaller scale, because historical figures, yes, they have all this depth to them, and you can do, I mean, you can do a 7-hour documentary on Eleanor Roosevelt, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be that complex. You know, when you get right down to it, it's the question of, why does this person matter? You know, like,
Yeah.
as basic as that, you know, and if you can get the person, if you can evoke the person visually, get a sense of how they dressed or did their hair or whatever,
Right.
and just get it. Why was this person important? That alone is huge. That's what you need. And I've done times when I've done, I did a 5-minute Amelia Earhart once, and just got up there and talked about what it felt like to be a pilot, to be going up in an airplane in the 1930s. How exciting that was.
Right.
That's huge, you know, and that's really, in some ways, that's enough. It can be full of depth, but it can be enough to just put it out there. And you know, the thing about the humanities, and the thing that's so great about historical portrayals, is that the portrayal itself is enough, but there's always all these other interesting things about it. I put together Lizzie Borden in part because the Ashland Chautauqua was doing a thing on heroes and villains. And of course, now that's been put off for a few years. But I was thinking about, you know, other lectures, other things that come up but have to do with it. And I thought, you know, there's a lot of parallels between the O.J. Simpson case and the Lizzie Borden case. Because when you think about it, I mean, they're both they were prominent people in their own circles and times. They were both people who were found not guilty, even though there were a lot of people who believed them guilty, and they both have had to live underneath this. And I thought, you know, those moments when it's kind of an opening, right? It's a way to get a discussion started about whatever, and it doesn't have to be, you know, that kind of thing. The great thing about Chautauqua is there's so much opportunity to talk and to get things going. And that's really valuable for a community. Eleanor Roosevelt was always saying this, you know, it doesn't matter if you agree with people. It's getting the discussion going that's so valuable. I started realizing, you know, when people were very stressed out at the beginning of the pandemic, and do you remember when everybody was like baking right away? That's when I put together a lecture on the history of Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker it's an amazing thing to do as history, because, oh my God, the number of people who have tattered and worn out and stained Betty Crocker cookbooks is huge. And I've been thinking a little bit about that kind of nostalgia. I mean, one reason Jackie Kennedy might be popular is because so many people dressed like her, right? You know, so many people had pillbox hats and wore white gloves. They're already there when you begin. That's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is how can I tap in? And again, right, it's all about the audience. How can I tap into something people already care about?